The first question you need to ask yourself when it comes to the Kennedy assassination is this: was it a conspiracy? Now, if you don't believe in a conspiracy, then you don't need to go any further. I won't waste your time. Please move on. But if you do believe in a conspiracy, then the next question you need to ask yourself is: was it a low level conspiracy or was it a high level conspiracy? Many theories have been proposed, but it's safe to say that most serious researchers in the Kennedy assassination agree that it was a high level conspiracy. The evidence doesn't support a bunch of guys from New Orleans being the original architects of this conspiracy. On the contrary, the evidence suggests a high level of sophistication and coordination. Just for the purposes of this argument, let's assume it was a high level conspiracy. Now, if you accept that, then the next question you must ask yourself is this: who authorized the decision to remove the president? One would have to look naturally at people who were older, more experienced, and respected. They would also have to be people who were in positions of power in order to get things done. In other words, they had to have clout. We certainly wouldn't look at someone who was in their early 40s or less, because they wouldn't have the clout and authority to cover up and commit an assassination. It would also be a group of people who were familiar with the government and the workings thereof. This would localize the elite committee to people who had worked in the Washington, D.C. area. When you narrow it down like this to people who are in government or have been in government, specifically the national government, and people who are older, wiser, and more experienced, there aren't too many people who fit into this category. Even if the idea to remove JFK was broached by a person not living in Washington, D.C., or familiar with Washington, D.C., you would still need to run it by the kind of people who are elder statesmen, respected, have clout, and are familiar with the United States government and its workings. Thus, the five people that I have presented in earlier arguments. And those people are Dwight Eisenhower, Henry Cabot Lodge, Allen Dulles, John McCloy, and Averell Harriman. Let us discuss each particular individual and why this individual would be included in the group. To begin with, let us generally state that all these men were born between 1890 and 1900, except for Henry Cabot Lodge, who was born in 1902. At the time of the Kennedy assassination, they would have been 65 to 70 years old. This is a pretty old age for that era. People didn't live as long. They would certainly fit in the category of being older and having more experience. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. was included because he was a prominent Boston Brahmin with extensive connections into the New England power structure of the United States. This is a significant force, these Boston Brahmins. Henry Cabot Lodge came from two prominent Boston families, the Cabots and the Lodges. Lodge was the grandson of Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and the great-grandson of Secretary of State Frederick Theodore Frelinghuysen, who served under President Chester Arthur. Additionally, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. had been a U.S. Senator. He was also in Eisenhower's cabinet as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He was instrumental in getting Dwight Eisenhower to run for president in 1952. He managed Dwight Eisenhower's campaign. He was also Richard Nixon's running mate for vice president in 1960. In 1963, he was ambassador to South Vietnam. He was instrumental, along with Averell Harriman, in creating the cable, which gave the South Vietnamese generals permission to kidnap and assassinate President Diem. And this is what ultimately led to our deepening involvement in Vietnam. Not surprisingly, Lodge was a long-time adversary of John Kennedy. The Kennedys and the Lodges were political enemies. Henry Cabot Lodge was also connected to corporate America. He was a significant stockholder in the United Fruit Company, which was instrumental in the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. Lodge's inclusion in the group would be critical from a political and corporate standpoint. He represented a critical link to corporate America and a significant power base within the United States, that being the Boston Brahmins. His opinion would be valued. Now, I'm going to go a little bit off the beaten path here because I think it's important to talk about the Boston Brahmins, lest you think I'm a little crazy. I'm going to read from Wikipedia. Boston Brahmins were immensely powerful from the 19th to the early 20th centuries, forming America's closest equivalent to an aristocracy through immense wealth from trade, including opium, influence over institutions like Harvard University, and law, shaping culture and maintaining strict social circles, though their overt power declined with 20th century immigration and changing demographics, leaving a lasting legacy of prestige. The sources of their power: wealth and business. They built fortunes in shipping, like the China opium trade, railroads and finance, establishing major corporations and banks. Through education and culture, they founded and funded institutions like Harvard, museums, and literary journals, molding Boston into the quote unquote Athens of America. Social and political influence. They dominated Boston's social scene, married within their elite circles, as being the Cabots, the Lowells, the Adamses, and they influenced politics behind the scenes. Old money and status. Their power came from inherited status, education, Puritan values, and a reputation for discretion, as captured by the saying, "The Cabots speak only to God." Now, there is a thought process out there that somehow their power is diminished. Don't you believe that for a second. Harvard University is their baby. They love that institution. And that institution is the most powerful institution in the world. They have millions of you suckered into thinking that they are the best and the brightest. There is no shortage of people who will run up to Harvard and come back waving their Harvard degree around to fool you. And it's going to get worse. Okay, let's talk about Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles also possessed a prominent ancestral lineage into the power structure of the United States. His maternal grandfather, John W. Foster, was Secretary of State under Benjamin Harrison, while his uncle by marriage, Robert Lansing, was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. His brother, John Foster Dulles, was Ike's Secretary of State. Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C. is named for him. Allen Dulles graduated from Princeton and George Washington University Law. He was a corporate lawyer at Sullivan & Cromwell. Sullivan & Cromwell was the law firm for the United Fruit Company. Allen Dulles owned shares in the United Fruit Company, which was the prime beneficiary when the CIA overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala. He was a prominent member of OSS, and he had been head of the Central Intelligence Agency for well over 10 years. He knew the secrets of the United States, and he knew all the prominent politicians. If regime change was going to take place, it was going to have to take place by people who knew how to conduct regime change. And no one had more experience in regime change than the CIA. Allen Dulles was also connected socially with all the other members of the group. Averell Harriman. Averell Harriman was the son of E.H. Harriman, the most prominent railroad magnate in the United States. Averell Harriman was an extremely wealthy man. In addition to being the inheritor of a railroad empire, he had also, along with his brother Roland, started what eventually became known as Brown Brothers Harriman, which was a prominent banking firm in the United States. His collective companies produced the Secretary of Defense under Eisenhower, Robert Lovett Jr. Robert Lovett Sr., his father, had headed the Union Pacific Railroad, which was E.H. Harriman's railroad. Averell Harriman was partners with George Herbert Walker in the pony business in the 1920s. George Herbert Walker had a daughter named Dorothy, who married Prescott Bush, who then went to work for Brown Brothers Harriman. George Herbert Walker Bush is the son of Prescott Bush and the grandson of George Herbert Walker. Averell Harriman had not only been a businessman, he was a special ambassador at large for many administrations, performing many tasks, including the National Recovery Act and Lend-Lease under FDR, and the Marshall Plan and NATO under Truman. He was a connected man and a powerful man. He would be included in the group because of his extensive connections, his experience, his wisdom, and his commitment to a Pax Americana. He was also a fully vested member of Skull and Bones, a Yale fraternity which included Henry Luce, Prescott Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, George Walker Bush, Robert Lovett Jr., Henry Stimson, George Bundy, William Bundy, Harvey Hollister Bundy, and many more. Harvey Hollister Bundy was good friends with Allen Dulles. William Bundy, Harvey Hollister Bundy's son, married Dean Acheson's daughter. John McCloy, obviously a friend, hosted a soiree for the young couple prior to their marriage. And this leads us to John McCloy, another soulmate who was invested in a Pax Americana. John McCloy was another ambassador at large for whatever the powers that be desired. He was a graduate of Harvard Law. He tutored the Rockefeller boys, David and Nelson, when he was just out of law school. He was a connected man. He later went on to become the president of Chase Manhattan Bank. He was a man who could be counted on to do whatever it took to get the job done. He was also a man who was not squeamish about breaking the law. He asked for illegal wiretaps. He was responsible for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, another unconstitutional illegal act. He was a man who could be counted upon by the ruling class. That's why he sat on the Warren Commission. John McCloy also had extensive contacts within the world of corporate America. He was the ultimate chairman of the board, and his opinion was highly respected. It would be difficult to think of a man more experienced in the affairs of corporate America than John McCloy. Here's a quote from Kai Bird's book on John McCloy. At the very beginning of the Cold War in 1946, John J. McCloy unabashedly wrote his earliest mentor, Philadelphia lawyer George Wharton Pepper, quote, "In the light of what has happened, I would take a chance on this country using its strength tyrannously. We need, if you will, a Pax Americana. And in the course of it, the world will become more receptive to the Bill of Rights viewpoint than if we do no more than devoutly wish for peace and freedom." Close quote. This imperial vision of a beneficent America attempting to impose its values on a hostile world became the rationale for a prolonged Cold War, fought not only in Europe, but throughout the developing world. That Cold War exists today because we have become war junkies, and as you can see in Vietnam and the Middle East, it is hardly beneficent. We have killed millions in attempting to impose a Pax Americana upon the world, whose hidden purpose, apparently, is to enrich American oligarchs. Finally, we turn to Dwight Eisenhower, who we have spent much time already on this channel. What more can I say that I have not said already? Let me just say this. You wouldn't get a group of people to agree to assassinate or remove John Kennedy from power without the approval of Dwight Eisenhower. He was considered a national hero. He was on a level above any other politician or any figure in the United States, and he behaved like one. Titans from corporate America regularly showered him with gifts, and oil titans like Sid Richardson kept Ike's freezers stocked to the brim with fine meats. His admirers even built him a guest cabin at Augusta, that's the golf course, free of charge. Ike was an American king. To run the risk of removing John Kennedy from power and have Dwight Eisenhower come out against you, or to say that something seemed fishy, would be unthinkable. Imagine if Dwight Eisenhower had said, I don't know about the Warren Commission. I think it's wrong. I think it needs to be re-examined. You wouldn't run that risk, because if Dwight Eisenhower had said that, people would follow him. the true perpetrators would risk getting caught. Dwight Eisenhower's stature alone would be enough to include him in the group. And if Dwight Eisenhower had thought that Kennedy should not be removed, he would not have been removed. He had that much power and deference paid to him by the other people in the group. These other men, Lodge, Harriman, McCoy, and Dulles, looked up to Ike, regardless of their political party or their political thinkings. And it didn't hurt that Ike, wasn't a fan of Kennedy. He thought Kennedy represented a cult of personality. That's like the pot calling the kettle black. Thus, the inner circle was set. This does not mean that other people were not consulted. David Talbot, in his book, The Devil's Chessboard, illustrates perfectly well that Allen Dulles was a consensus builder. Allen Dulles absolutely would talk to everyone who he knew in the political world, domestic and foreign, to get their opinions on John Kennedy. Of course he would. That's the CIA's job, to collect information. And it doesn't matter one whit that Dulles, prior to the assassination, was not the acting director of the CIA. He was still held in high esteem by former colleagues, titans of corporate America, and leaders around the world. Of course, in talking to leaders, Dulles would never phrase things so bluntly like this. Do you think we should take out John Kennedy? That would be treasonous. Dulles and these other men were all politically sophisticated people. They had lived a life in politics. They were well versed in knowing how to present their arguments and propositions in such a way that no one would ever suspect that they were thinking about regime change or assassination. They were all politically smooth, and they were all well versed in Washington politics. They all possessed extensive contacts. They all knew each other, and they were all elder statesmen. Here are their birth dates. Allen Dulles, April 7th, 1893. Dwight Eisenhower, October 14th, 1890. Henry Cabot Lodge, July 5th, 1902. Averell Harriman, November 15th, 1891. John J. McCloy, March 31st, 1895. If you accept a conspiracy, and then a high-level conspiracy, you must then ask yourself, who were the people who had the ultimate authority to approve regime change? You will not find 5 men more prominent than these.